Hi everyone and welcome to the Empowered You podcast. I'm Javi Israel, your host, speaking to you from Sydney, Australia. After October 7, I found myself in uncomfortable situations, not sure how to respond or navigate. That's why I created the Empowered You, first an organization and now a podcast to equip you with the knowledge, skills, and tools surrounding Israel and your Jewish identity. In each episode, we'll explore various topics from multiple perspectives so that you can feel informed, empowered, and proud of who you are. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Empowered You podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Ari Lander, historian, educator, and founder of Voices of Survival. Ari holds a PhD in history, has taught Zionism, modern Jewish history, and Holocaust and genocide studies at UNSW, and has spent much of his career working with survivors and preserving their stories, including at the Sydney Jewish Museum. Today, Voices of Survival brings Holocaust survivors, genocide survivors, and other powerful voices into schools and communities, helping people connect through their history and their firsthand testimony and story to ensure that never again is now. In our conversation, we discussed genocide education, storytelling, Zionism, Jewish identity, and some of the challenges facing our world today. Before we begin, I want to take note that while I deeply respect Ari and the important work he is doing, I do not agree with all of his views or perspectives. And that's okay, because part of what the Empowered You is engaging thoughtfully with ideas and hearing different viewpoints and having respectful conversations, even if we don't see eye to eye on every issue. Ari is a gifted storyteller, and this is a wide-ranging conversation filled with fascinating stories and insights and plenty of food for thought. I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with someone who you think will find it meaningful. Now let's get into it. Hello, Dr. Jonathan Ari Lander. It's such an honor to have you here on the Empowered You podcast today. And before we get into all the incredible things that you have been doing, can you first tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, so we get a little feel for who you are?
Thank you, Javi. And I just want to say thank you. And it was lovely to sit in your lounge room. Gosh, time moves so fast. A few weeks ago and hear a bit about what you've been through and, just your story. Husband, Meir Chazan. I actually met a mutual friend of ours yesterday, and your husband sung at his brother's bar mitzvah in a Jewish community, particularly, I'd say, a small community like this. So I grew up most of my life here in Sydney. I was born actually in Colombia, Bogota. My parents adopted me in 81 or end of 81, 82. And so I always tell people I sort of won the lottery, that things were so bad in Bogota that there were various Jewish families that adopted kids from Bogota. And my family always told me that I was adopted. And at the same time, when I was very young, they wanted to keep me connected with my Colombian heritage. So there were artworks in the house that were from Colombia. There was some traditional Colombian clothing, and we used to go and meet other kids who were also adopted. So I think it's really interesting to think what family is, what community is. And in that terms of that point I made about winning the lotto, like my Abba and Imma were always my Abba and Imma growing up, but they gave me everything. I had such a loving family, and they made me part of a loving community. So I grew up quite from, not Chabad, but modern Orthodox, Dati Leumi, and my family was very Zionistic. My family tried to make Aliyah when I was a little kid, so we went there for a little while in the 80s. I get the time period wrong, but roughly just short of 2 years, a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. And it was in the 80s, in the Shmonim, there was a recession. So my family came back. But my first memories of ever being on planet Earth are related to that trip and being in Israel and being in Gun and stuff like that, and running around little streets, seeing the alley cats and so forth. And later on, I grew up in Sydney, which is a wonderful experience. I'll say my family's a little exotic in the sense my mum's side is Iraqi Indian, but also I had family born in Burma. So my great uncle, Alav Hashlom, Ezekiel Masliach, was the only rabbi to serve in Calcutta since the community had been set up. So their first Shaliach Tzibur was a Halabi, like Syrian. So the Jews of Calcutta had a unique nusach. something my family was very proud of. And my late grandfather, also Alav Hashalom, was a secular Jew, but he'd set up a kahila to honor those unique customs for Jews who come from the Far East, those Jews who've gone to India, Singapore, Shanghai, and so forth. And then my father's side was from that mixture of area of Poland, Ukraine, but also Lithuanian. So even though my Zeta was not a Nitzolah Shoah, not a survivor of the Holocaust, I grew up in a community surrounded by that. You know, I was old enough that if I went Beit Knesset to Shul on Shabbat, we were surrounded by survivors, some of whom later on I would work with when I worked at the Sydney Jewish Museum.
In regards to being adopted, was that ever something that was difficult for you?
Yeah, it could be. It was difficult at times emotionally. And there were times in my childhood I was ashamed by it, or I knew that, you know, because my parents couldn't have children, there were emotional sensitivities around it. And sometimes somebody would say something careless about it. Or I'll say there are times in the world when I was from where even though, you know, as I understand halakhically, the understanding is you never shame a convert. In our community, anyone who was a convert, everyone knew. And they'd talk about it. Say, oh, do you know that person's a convert? And it was so interesting. And the same thing happened to me, that if kids wanted to insult you as a madrich when you led them, they'd be like, say, oh, you don't look Jewish, or everyone knows you're not Jewish. It was the weirdest thing that because people knew. That's how you go. So I don't want to demonize the community. I'm saying it struck me because but it definitely, I had quite a few experiences like that, or experiences with certain things that happened to me in my life that rabbis brought it up or treated me in a way that I thought was insensitive to the realities of being somebody who'd been adopted. So when I was born in Bogota, Colombia, it's like the most dangerous city basically in the world, according to the UN. It's on the verge of becoming a narco state, basically due to the cocaine trade and the various different cartels. But obviously, as I understand from the history I've read, particularly the cartel that's associated with Pablo Escobar, it's a very, very dangerous city. And so even though I was in a Catholic orphanage, they're letting like a family they know is from and Jewish, observant and Jewish, will take a kid out of that to be not raised as Catholic, which is quite an amazing thing. And the woman who was in charge of it, won awards was recognized by Colombia for the amazing work she did to save these kids. And some kids didn't get adopted. You know, some of those kids stayed in that orphanage and got raised there. So I think, the absence of my birth parents and the decision of what they made, we can deal with in different ways psychologically. But later on, because of the work I did, working with trauma victims, many of whom were children, I was aware that there were some things that I could connect with them over. I never thought of it that way originally, but later on, working at the Sydney Jewish Museum, some of the survivors I worked with would tell their story because they got adopted by other families or given to other families and never knew their birth parents. And even if your parents making that as a decision to save your life, it can still be a painful sense of abandonment. My circumstances are somewhat different to that, in the sense that, as I understand it, and everyone deals with this differently psychologically, in my journey of taking care of my mental health, the wonderful clinical support I got was very much like I need to acknowledge the question of my birth parents abandoning me. And that was a healthy thing for me to come to grips with. It'll be something I'd push to the side. I've seen pictures of what the orphanage looked like. I called and spoke with a friend of mine who spoke fluent Spanish many years ago when I was trying to track down and get access to my parents, and they'd destroyed all the paperwork. And that was painful to be like, the parents didn't want me to track me down. The process, even now, of me being able to tell this to you, I'm very calm about, like I've dealt with it. But the process of working with trauma victims who've been through such intense pain and loss, very different to my lucky life. At the same time, some people find that process of thinking it through, acknowledging it. And when I say acknowledging it, it means understanding what it means to you emotionally. And then there's an emotional and cognitive journey of how you deal with it. It might be through art. It might be through storytelling. It might be just pushing it to the side. It might be through interviews like this, whatever that process is. If you find there's for that process of acknowledgement, that you come out at the other end and you're like, okay, this is a part of who I am. And there's a deep sense of, cool, I'm happy with who I am. Like, I came to that conclusion. I like me. I'm not perfect. I'm flawed like anyone else, but I'm wanting to be the best possible version of who I am. And it acknowledges that pain and loss. And eventually that process is something I think about when I work with survivors, and why some survivors should find spaces to share their stories. And if they do so, that acknowledgement will lead them to a better place emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, where that owning of the story becomes a really important space of self-recognition.
Do you feel in a way God kind of like we're going to get into the work that you do, and it's a very sensitive space. And I mean, naturally, you're already a sensitive person, just your soul. I feel like your soul is a very kind and sensitive soul. But do you ever feel grateful that you, I guess, were adopted because now you have this sensitivity and understanding towards the people that you're working with that perhaps you wouldn't have if you weren't adopted? Does that ever occur to you? Or
Yeah, I think that like it's an interesting thing we'll talk, I understand later on, say, for example, working with other survivor communities. And even when you work with Shoah survivors, if you're Jewish, they'll make connections in certain ways. I think it's really important for survivors to work with people who are not from their community or have different political, religious experiences. That's part of the reason why I do the work I do. So why I'm saying that is that for me, at least, there were certain experiences, like when I was teaching at university, the Shoah, and really, even though my PhD wasn't about it, I was interviewing a few people who'd fled the Shoah, who'd ended up here, some of them without their families. And so it's different to me, but I was aware there were similarities, what it meant to be without your parents in some sense. And their parents had sent them at a very young age, say just after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, or, just before World War II starts, they end up here alone with no one. And there's a mixed sense of like, I won the lottery, but I also got abandoned by my birth parents. I want to be with mum and dad. And so without getting too intense at the beginning of our talk, but we know there are cases where, for example, say in a ghetto in Poland, where Catholic families or non-Jewish Polish people would come to people in the ghetto and say, give us your kid, we can maybe save your kid. And the mothers wouldn't give their kids away because they thought, I don't want to say I don't know what they thought, but it seems from anecdotally or some of the interviews we had, it's a hard thing to reconstruct exactly what happened emotionally there, but it seems quite clear they couldn't give their child away. Right? They didn't want to believe they were going to be murdered, even though they've been seeing so much murdering around them. But the idea that they, as a mother, couldn't be there with their child and to protect their kid, they couldn't abandon their child. That would reflect poorly on them. I'm trying to summarize. It's really hard to reconstruct that moment, but it's an awful act of, I'm not judging that parent. I think there's really important when you work in history as much as possible. Primo Levi called the gray zones, this awful reality of this mother who loves their kids more than anything in the world and can't abandon it. Even though they know that, say, for example, if you're in Krakow, children are being murdered in axions and then children be sent to a Vernichtungslager, an annihilation camp. They know that, and yet they hold on to their kids. So that's a horrific reality to deal with. And that emotional reality of being abandoned and so forth. And so that's something I've thought about a lot. And when I was reading a lot, that comes back constantly in the show or in Cambodia or in Rwanda, the things you do to save a child or the things people to not be able to save a child. So that's haunting. And so that fed through as I thought and realized something I was dealing with was the question of the abandonment by my birth parents. And that was not something I dealt with while I was doing my research as my doctorate, but I was aware when I was reading the interviews or reading stuff about the show I didn't know then that I was like, wow, this is emotionally impactful anyway, but there's me as who I am as Ari just reading this history. And my journey means it's having a particular resonance, not deep and not more profound, but just in terms of where I was cognitively, emotionally, that it affected me in a particular way.
Wow. Gosh. Yeah. It's sensitive and it's emotional and it's complex and it's so multifaceted. Ari, can you tell us what do you do? Because you do a lot of things, but let's start.
So I'll say right now, I recently set up an organization called Voices of Survival. And what we're doing is we're bringing together survivors of war, natural disaster, and various acts of extreme violence. But at this stage, we're focusing on survivors of genocide, war, and natural disasters. That team includes survivors from the Holocaust, stolen generation survivors, survives the Cambodian genocide, the genocide against the Tutsi, or the genocide that happened in Rwanda in 1994, survivors from the Sudanese conflicts, from Bosnia. I've got a woman who survived Srebrenica I'm in conversation with. It also includes Burundians and a survivor of the Sri Lankan tsunami, a survivor of religious persecution who's from Pakistan. And the idea is that while I worked at the Sydney Jewish Museum, I taught comparative genocide to school students and also to teachers and also to Catholic teachers who are coming for a program. And when we did that program, I had an opportunity sometimes to do panels. And it sounds like a bad joke, but I'd have a Holocaust survivor, an Aboriginal elder, a Cambodian and a Rwandan, and you put them in conversation. I didn't always have all the time or resource to do it, but the idea is I go out of work, meet them on my own, that survivor, and learn some of their story, then bring them together and think about how the 3 or 4 of them, how we might do an interview. And I did that for many, many reasons. It was a lot of work, but there were these astonishing moments that happened that I think back to more and more, and I'll try and illustrate with an example. The first time I did that as a panel, I had a man who was amazing. George Gonoyski was a survivor from Ojejov in Poland, just on the border. So his town was occupied right at the start of World War II. He ends up in various ghettos and is liberated on a death march after coming out of Buchenwald. Unfortunately, George Zichronovo Livracha passed in 4 years ago now. It was, I think, 94, if I recall correctly. And I used to visit him sometimes in the old age home when he was in Montefiore. And he was amazing. I loved interviewing George. And when I did this panel, the understanding was, because we were in the Sydney Jewish Museum, and George's younger sister, I'm going to get her age now wrong, I believe it was 8 or 9. Her name was Hannah Mulca. Mulca obviously being queen, that was her middle name. And if you go to the Children's Museum, when it gets open, anyone who's listening to this, there's a beautiful plaque that just says Hannah Mulca Gonoyski, because he didn't have a picture of her. And he spoke about how not having a picture of her meant she was fading from his mind, and that was the most painful thing. And when we did this panel, there were many moments like this that were quite beautiful and touching. But one of them was we had agreed that because we were in the Sydney Jewish Museum, because George was the oldest, and this was a memorial that honored his family, his mother and father were murdered. I think he calculated roughly 114 members of his family were murdered in the Shoah. And I said, okay, I asked whatever the first question was to George. George stood up. I think it was 89, 88 at the time. He said, actually, I think at this time we need to actually ask Uncle Wee, who was the Aboriginal elder. He's a Wongabong man from the Whalewen Nation. And he said he should speak first because we're on his land. What a beautiful, generous thing. This Aboriginal elder has come into a museum that's very wealthy, very plush, very intimidating for other communities. They're like, wow, because they know we built it. I've walked around with the survivors and they're going, this is amazing. Like, I wish we had something like this. And so there can be a sense of awe because they don't have a similar sort of grand cultural institution that's honoring the memory of their loved ones in the same way. And it's deeply moving going on tours like that with all those survivors. Yeah, it was a profound experience. And I thought, what an act of absolute generosity. Then instead of beginning with him, and I could, everyone was kind of emotional in different ways, but I could see that George was emotional. I was like, no, I need to acknowledge your land. Gone through a process of dispossession and the violence, and he heard some of the things Uncle Whittier went through, and he created an empathetic space for this elder first. He had these two people had such loss and pain, and there's a thing that can occur between survivors where it's an intergenerational, intercommunal healing. That's what George was giving Uncle Whitty, and Uncle Whitty was giving George. You and I have been, in some sense, in a space, a hellscape, such pain and such loss that for us it's possibly unimaginable, or maybe we can imagine it, but it's something we'll hope we do haven't experienced. And it occurs often, not always, but sometimes a profound connection between a survivor and another survivor. And they can hold and cradle that for each other. And that eventually became the reason for creating Voice of Survival. The teaching, Lahav Torechok, that you love thy neighbor as thyself. I think you can only do that when you know your neighbor's story, but you've also made the time to create a space for your neighbor's story.
So Voices of Survival is an organization that you started. And tell us what do you guys do practically, meaning the actual sessions that you run? Who do you run it for? Tell us about that.
I work with genocide survivors who come from Africa, Asia, the Holocaust, Australia, from Europe. And I'll give you just one example. I work, say, for example, with survivors from the genocide in Rwanda. So in 1994, between April and July, in around 100 days, there's somewhere around, we don't know exactly, the lowest estimate's 500,000, the highest estimate is 1 million human beings are murdered, and mainly with machetes. So alongside parts of the Holocaust, it's the most rapid destruction of human life in human history. And I work with survivors from that genocide. So prior to Voice of Survival, I ran an organization that was just focused with Rwandan survivors. And I left that team to continue to hopefully set up that organization I ran, which was called Listen and Remember in English, or Kumva and Kwibuka in Kinyarwanda. And this organization, I've been doing that for 4 years. I wanted to bring in the different survivors I was working with because I was still working sometimes with a Holocaust survivor, sometimes with a stolen generation survivor, and they're getting older. They won't be around much longer, the boys from Kinshasa or Holocaust survivors. One of my team members, and I'll honor him here, Peter Reisman, was supposed to speak with me at Sydney University on the 16th of April, and he passed away on the weekend. And I literally spoke to him on the phone 10 days ago or something. And then I sent him a few messages because I knew he was in a lot of pain. And I just, wished him a refuah shlema. And the last message I sent, I didn't even get a reply. And then my colleague told me. So that's the space we're in. So for me, I think every story is sacred. But I think when you just give the time, so what we do is we go into a school mainly, but we're trying to do programs with synagogues, programs with police, and reaching out to hospitals and so forth for training for their staff. We can talk about that, why I do that later on. But I'm just saying mainly, if I go into a school, these young kids, I used to think they didn't need to learn about the Holocaust, really. Like, why does a kid need to learn about Treblinka? 950,000 Jews murdered, 150 survive. When you really study what Treblinka does, it's horrific. Like, I think it's so traumatic. There's no meaning that gets extracted from that. And I've changed my mind. I really feel passionately that we have a responsibility to not look away. And that not looking away, if we create a space for a survivor to share, you allow the survivor to heal because we've created a space of acknowledgement. Because I'll be honest, like, I know a lot of Holocaust survivors, they weren't very good parents. I don't judge that. I know why. A lot of them, they couldn't tell their kids they love them. They didn't hug them. They weren't emotionally present and available because some things break and some things don't heal properly ever. So for me, what I love going into a school, for example, say with my Rwandan survivor. I'll say this survivor, Bahati, she's been shot. She's had her head beaten in. She's witnessed her very close friend, I'll be very blunt here, violently raped in front of her. And her friend has never gotten over that, has never had kids, never had a husband because of what those men did to her. Again, some things just break. And we go in and we tell that story. Now, what I just said was really rough, really tough. We don't just dump the kids in there. We begin great teachings from Yad Vashem, always learning from people, that we begin with some cute, fun games where it might be teaching some language in Kinyarwanda. Bahati is illiterate because of her experiences, but speaks 7 languages from 5 unrelated language groups. She's incredibly smart and incredibly articulate. And it's very raw for her. So she's still very emotional, but she speaks to it, and I guide her through in an interview. So it's a PowerPoint with images to assist us. We talk about the amazing farm that she owns in Rwanda, about her amazing son who'll never know his father because his father was actually German, but he passed away before he was born. And he's classic second gen. Her son is dealing with all the things that I see the children of Holocaust survivors deal with. Classic, not I say classic, like that sounds like a little box stereotype it, but he's on that long journey. I've seen a lot of children of Holocaust survivors go on. So we go in there to allow people to encounter this human being and to have a conversation, lots of questions. Just to, I think it's so important while they're Holocaust survivors for people to be a Holocaust survivor. It makes it human, it makes it real. And the same thing here. And then sometimes when we have the funds and resources from a school, we'll bring in, like last year I did a program with an amazing Sudanese survivor, Banlotto, who's in the team. She runs her own organization, but also speaks with me. And she was speaking alongside Ernie Friedlander, who's a 90-year-old survivor, born in Vienna, ended up in the Budapest ghetto, and his father was murdered in one of the satellite camps of Mauthausen. And Abang's father was a prominent politician. They murdered him, and cruelly, awfully, they dumped him in the river. So neither of them would ever have a place to bury their father. And we did a conversation for an amazing, wonderful school that allows me to go in with my Rwandan team and also do full days on the Holocaust. And these kids are amazing. Beautiful questions, attentive. I do a whole day Holocaust program at 9 in the morning to 3:15 in the afternoon. And these kids are amazing. And then we, in the middle of the year, bring in a Rwandan survivor.
And you're going to Jewish and non-Jewish schools.
Yeah, public, private, any school.
So you're basically educating children about, the consequences of genocide. We know the world is saying that Israel is committing a genocide. From your perspective, I'm sure that you've encountered this question of Israel is committing a genocide. How do you respond to that?
So I did my PhD on Zionism relating to youth movements here in Australia in the lead up to it. And I describe myself as a Zionist. And I think as a national liberation movement does things that are very interesting. Like, say, for example, if you look at Pinsky and the beautiful question of auto-emancipation, that it's about a understanding that living in Europe or North Africa or the Middle East, Jews don't have autonomy. And without autonomy, you don't have real freedom. Without real freedom, you don't have intellectual and spiritual freedom to create your own culture. So the state of Israel, I think in the nation state game we have, no one wants to be a Yazidi right now. The Kurds, I think, just lost a couple of soldiers possibly in this current war that's going on. They want a state. That's how you survive. So I think if I put it crudely, I think both Zionism and Palestinian nationalists have both made mistakes, lots of mistakes, and they've focused on their own pain and suffering. And I think both national groups need to find spaces of reckoning and empathy to understand why the other side feels they're totally right. It's interesting in the space I'm in. I've gone and volunteered to speak. And I've said, hi, I work with Holocaust survivors, I work with Rwandans, and I work with Stolen Gen. And I'm working on this program for this reason I'm doing here. And we're going to talk about mental health, for example. And at the end, I got called out for not denouncing genocide in Gaza. This was like 18 months ago. And I was, for various reasons, thought it was so problematic what had happened. I literally was coming in to volunteer. And in my circle of people that we were talking, there were people from Sudan, Ukraine, China, Burma, and none of them were asked to call out what their countries did. Me as an Australian citizen, I was. They didn't know my politics. They didn't know what I'd been through emotionally, but because I didn't acknowledge genocide in Gaza, apparently I had done a form of neo-colonial control of the conversation. And I've had a lot of experiences like that, I'll be very honest.
It's also when people say that anti-Zionism is not connected to anti-Semitism, get a reality check.
Yeah, look, I would broadly agree. I think there are, I think Zionism is a product of a particular Jewish cultural experience. And even when it's so secular, it's still a product of Yahadut.
Of course.
And reaction from, when you argue, when we see the roots of it, and I think Zionism as a nationalist movement is fascinating and distinct in many ways, but it comes late to the game of creating a nation state, and that creates problems for it. But then also Jews are undergoing a terrible situation in Europe. And I'm talking even the end of the 1800s and then leading into the 21st century, that I think understandably we become obsessed with our own suffering. And then alternatively, Palestinians, the emerging Palestinian nationalist movement, also become obsessed with their own suffering. And neither side can sometimes see that they're a mirror image of each other. And that's a sad thing and a complicated thing. So for me, from the little bit I understand, and from, I was actually listening to a conversation between, I'll say it's an interview, I think it's called Coleman and Sam Harris. I'm not always a fan, I agree with everything, but both of them were very stridently why it's not a genocide. And listening to them, I was like, yeah, that's fair enough. I'll say as a non-specialist, I later on listened to somebody else who's an academic who I know, and she had actually a residency briefly at the Sydney Jewish Museum. And she's a professor of law, and she wrote an article saying why it was genocide. I listened to an interview she had. I was like, okay, I see why she's saying this. So I get why I'm saying this is I think it's really important to keep it in. For me, I keep an open mind because I'm not a specialist. If I pause here and said, I find it astonishing that people have leapt to such a quick conclusion. It seems to me without actually having enough of a body of evidence. They want to judge Israel. That seems to me clear. Actually haven't had the emotional bandwidth. My focus is here on the work I can do and the good I can do. That, for example, last year I went into a space with a Pakistani Muslim, and we came from very different spaces. He's also secular. He's also described myself as a cultural Muslim, and we were going out to school kids to create a program, a conversation between a Jew and a Muslim. But when I put Abang and Ernie in conversation, they both had their father murdered, it takes a huge amount out of me. I'll be very open. A lot of thinking. She's in her 40s, he's in his 90s. It's intergenerational, it's intercultural, and they come from vastly different cultures. But it's a lot of work. And for me, the focus I want to do and what I can cope with emotionally, because the work I do, is those common connections. So we're all human beings. But whether you're a Palestinian or Israeli, you don't want to suffer. That you don't want to see kids be murdered, hopefully. There are exceptions to that on both sides, but people are very violent and racist. So for me, what I'm interested in is building bridges and connections. I'm here in Australia. I'm very proud of being Jewish. I describe myself as a Zionist for a variety of reasons, and that's partially my family history, but also the positive aspects of Zionism. I think right now, if I'll give you an example, if anyone tells you they know what's going to happen in the conflict with Iran, Israel, and the United States, and they have black and white answers, I'm very worried about that. Same thing with Ukraine, right? And the reason why I'm saying that is I find it really disturbing and quite astonishing often. I was on the street the other day and had a conversation with the most lovely Australian, but he's a great guy. And he was very sure that Jews just want to conquer more land. And it was really interesting that he come to that conclusion. And I'll say even the Rwandans in my team, some of them thought, yeah, it's genocide because of what they see on TV. And that was funny. I said to them, but you've always talked about how TV is so simplistic when it talks about what happens in Africa. Yet when you've watched the 5-minute grab that's on the news, you're able to make a judgment from that. Isn't it best just to simply stand back for now and say, you don't know because it's not something you're specialized in? So I withhold judgment for now. I think that's the best place for me intellectually and emotionally.
I feel people have this apologetic tone if they are a Zionist, especially in the secular space.
Yeah.
I am a Zionist, but I don't agree with all the Zion. Why are we being apologetic for being a Zionist? We have taken on the way that lots of people view that term in a negative light, and I can see how we've inherited it. And even people who are apologetic about being Jewish, we've allowed for this anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism to infiltrate. No, I don't know if the word's infiltrate, but we've adopted it in some ways. We've internalized it. That's the word. Anyway.
So look, okay, So if I say, look, I think that can be healthy. I think there's a healthy schizophrenia to Jewishness where we can be very self-critical. And I think that's important. So if I said, for example, the question of the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem, because Israel has liberal archival laws, we have the orders that relate to orders being given for the expulsion of Palestinian cities and populations. Whereas when I was a kid, I didn't learn that at school, but out of my own fascination, I read people like Benny Morris, and then later on, people who are on the hardcore argument it was an act of ethnic cleansing, like Ilan Pape. Like if you're going to engage in an argument, you actually have to read them. You don't have to agree with them, but if you don't agree with them, you have to know why you don't agree with them. You can't just say, I don't agree with Norman Finkelstein because I don't agree with Norman Finkelstein. I think a lot of times when I've listened to things that Norman Finkelstein has said, I've agreed with it. And he's convinced me of his arguments. So I went on, I was quite left-wing before. And then on my journey of reading a lot of Israeli historiography, and whether it was books about the lead up and say the Palestinian revolt, the crucial events in the 1930s, or the question of the 48 war, the Nakba, or the War of Independence. I think, I'm saying those both because history can be both those things. It can be the truth to a Jew who's leaving persecution in North Africa, not a great place to be a Jew. You don't have to pretend it's all like a golden history of Jews living in North Africa or the Levant or in Yemen. Yemenite Jews are leaving and joining the Shuv because it's not great to be a Jew in Yemen. Not many Jews, not all, but many. And it's not great to be a Jew leading up into World War II and post-World War II either, obviously. And then there's the positive message of Zionism too. So I think there's absolutely a truth to that simultaneously Zionism can be a liberation movement for Jews. But because, and as it's discussed by Zionist leaders at the time, that those who I admire, like Akala Am and so forth, and that famous quote, the bride is already taken, is there's a population of Palestinians there. And then this nascent nationalist movement is starting to think of being Palestinian, and Palestinians have a profound autochthonous connection to land, just like Jews do. Like, I know when I go to Eretz Israel, I feel very connected. I feel very connected to Australia too. When I went to India, I feel connected too in a different way. Everyone has their own psychosomatic makeup on how they connect to land and history and myth and so forth, and how it resonates with them intellectually, emotionally. I can just speak to my journey. So I can understand there's an emotional, historical truth that's two things. And that from an Israeli perspective, the question of why, when the UN came forward to vote on this, and countries like Syria bargained with their Jewish population and said, if you vote for this, we don't think Jews are a national group. You're just a religious group. But if you do vote for it, we can't control our own population, which was a lie, and they will murder our Syrian Jews. What a horrific thing to say, that they were bargaining with the lives of their citizens, who they said were more Arab than Jewish, but they're willing to bargain their lives and say, if you vote for a Jewish state, we'll let the uprising on the Arab streets result in the massacre of men, women, and children. That's what we're going to say to the UN. So I think it's cynical and cruel what they did. Absolutely. And morally reprehensible. And on the other side, I can understand that the Zionist movement is so caught up in its own thing that they need to create a state, that there are acts of violence and war crimes they've committed in the birth of the state of Israel. That happens in war all the time. And we need to be honest with it. And the same thing with Palestinians, when the first section of the war was Palestinians fighting Israelis. And I can understand, what I'm saying is, as a historian, my duty is to embed myself, and it's not my area, but nonetheless, I spent a long time reading that. And if you're going to
So what is Zionism to you, and why are you a Zionist?
Firstly, I need to acknowledge the flaws. Zionists, we're Jews, we're just human beings. She'oref, we're stiff-necked people. The Tanakh itself says we'll make a million mistakes. I'm saying this as an atheist Jew, but I think it correctly describes aspects of our national character. So we'll make mistakes because we're human beings. Just like Melech David will be brutal in war and have too many wives and concubines, so will we be brutal in war. Like, everyone is brutal in war. So why I'm saying this I'm asking to say, I think it's really important for me to acknowledge the question of, I'm proudly a Zionist, and it's not being like, as you correctly described, some people are like, oh, I need to be scared about saying, no, I go into meetings all the time now. I had a meeting with my colleagues for an government organization, and I said I'm a Zionist. It was very interesting. I asked, well, what does that mean? And we want to understand more. I went into another meeting for an organization that wanted to partner with me, would have served me. And I said, listen, I want you to know, because I've seen some stuff you've said on social media. I want to let you know first, to begin this conversation, I'm a Zionist. So it's not something I'm shirking around. So why I'm saying this is, I believe there's a healthy conversation about a very fraught conflict. That means from the beginning, I acknowledge this nationalist movement has made, that I identify as myself as part of, has made mistakes. First thing I do when I teach about Australia, I love being Australian. I won the lottery by coming to Australia, but we committed genocide in Australia. And I said I wasn't even born here. But we need to have memorials that acknowledges there's over 500 massacres against our First Nations peoples. We had states that had it illegal to marry an Aboriginal person, that we had awful acts of violence that truly horrify you once you realize what we did in these massacres and what it meant, that we had entire areas where Aboriginal women were taken as sex slaves, right? And we had a process basically of indentured slavery without calling it that. And then also on top of that, we eventually had a program of taking Aboriginal children away from their families to breed out their Aboriginality. I think that's an important, I'd begin there, and then I'd say why I'm proud of being Australian. So same thing as a Zionist. I'd say, so here I go and say there's realpolitik. You're in the Middle East right now, the state exists. Even me as a Jew has a right of return. I think it's astonishing and rather interesting that there's such a debate about the right of Israel to exist, but no one's having a similar debate. Should Russia have a right to exist after what it did in Ukraine and Crimea, or what it's done in other areas in Europe? I think it's that quite astonishing. I think there's a double standard there. I think there's a fascination with the Jew that means we're so embedded in the European psyche because Christianity is born from Judaism, and because we're the only minority group in Europe, that Europe seeks to find itself largely in opposition in many ways to the Jew. And yet at the same time, eventually, European nationalism does an astonishing thing, and that's le Juif, the Jew, to become part of the French nation, to be part of the French nation. It's something radical they do. And their first conversation around that is around Jews. So you have like national prizes in Germany to write an essay, should Jews be allowed to be part of the German nation or not? So it means we occupy this very, very unique scape, and that culminates in acts of extreme violence like the Crusades and so forth, or the massacres that take place in World War I in what becomes the Soviet Union. culminating in the Shoah.
Mm.
And when you have a state that protects your culture and the amount of Jewish learning that we have now produced because we've had a state, musically, literary, Jewish learning, revitalizing a language and so forth, that's only possible when you have a nation state. As a Jew faced towards Yerushalayim, let's say you wish for the return of, the kingdoms of David and so forth, that you go and say, Yetziat Mitzrayim is the crucial narrative of, I don't think of it historically accurate, but as this myth that resonates with me as a Jew of what it means to have homeland and homeland being essential for the defining aspects of your national identity. And at the same time, there also being a diasporic identity. Those two things are the two realities of Jewish identity. That Jerusalem is central, but the Talmud was written, the main Talmud that we learn is not the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's the Talmud Bavli. The script that you and I write in, that the Tanakh is written in, comes from the Persian Empire. Jewish culture has always been syncretic. We've always learned from the cultures around us, sometimes to fault, sometimes correctly. And so the reality is our culture in many ways was born in the Middle East, and that's just a historical reality. And that we look back to our connections and roots being there. And so those stories, those songs, that literature, those family gatherings where you recount the stories of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, or the story of Megillah Esther in Persia, currently the conflict in Iran, or talking about, the various conflicts that happened with the Maccabean and so forth. Or later on, when I became obsessed with history, reading Josephus's War, and then later on studying at university and realizing those three massive revolts we had against the Roman Empire were one of the most defining events actually in Roman imperial history, when they decided to commit what most academics would argue was a genocide against the Judean kingdom. And I'll say from the Roman perspective, I get why they committed genocide. I get why they committed genocide in Carthage too. And then that's a trauma for me. The question of there was a genocide perpetrated in Jerusalem, and I feel a profound connection. And that's now honored in this very important monument of Titus's Arch, right? And they discuss this, all the ancient texts. So my land, my history is connected as a human being, broadly to being a human being, but also to my specificity of my culture and my land, and how land in my culture defines identity. That rootedness matters, the idea of shoresh and roots, of where you come from can define. So the idea of know from where you'll come and then you'll know where you're going. So last thing I'll wrap up on, my grandfather was a Zionist. He helped, and my grandmother that helped set up the state of Israel. My adopted mother was born in Israel. She imbibed in me this love of Israel. And later on, I continued that, but also in a critical way. We're doing stuff wrong all the time. So I think, need a healthy self-criticism of us too. And so I grew up in a community of loving Israel because my grandfather, my mother, living in Israel as a kid, my family tried to make Aliyah, living in Israel afterwards, but also being in a very volatile place of argument and discussion. So for many years, I was obsessed with Israeli Zionist Palestinian historiography. There's many Palestinian academics, poets and writers as I could. The same thing with Israelis and Jewish. And that became something for many years I was obsessed with before. Now I've shifted my focus. I need to focus on what I can do and what I can't change. But I think we have a wonderful tradition in our culture of being very critical of us as a nation. And I think that's something we should not lose sight of. But I think it's also complicated how we create safe spaces for that.
It's so interesting. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I mean, clearly, and I love chatting to you because our worldview is completely different. Like you said that you're an atheist Jew, and I know what you're thinking, that I'm thinking, that there's no such thing as an atheist Jew. And that's my belief. Talking, you are an intellectual academic being who really thinks deeply into everything. Like even answering a question, there's so much depth and from one story to the next. And I don't agree with everything that you're saying, but I find
You
it
shouldn't.
so
You shouldn't. You
fascinating.
shouldn't. Yeah. I don't think you
But
should.
I also think
If I ask
maybe
you, could I ask
yeah.
you, for you, when you think about the question of importance of stories in Jewish culture, do you think it's unique? Do we have a unique way of thinking about stories in Jewish culture, or is it similar to other people and other groups?
It's not something that I've really thought about, to be honest with you. But I think that the way that we share stories is not unique to the Jewish culture. I know First Nations, they have yarning. I do think that the Pesach Seder is a pretty experiential, unique
Mm.
way of sharing a story. I know you called it a myth, and I'm like, This is Torah. It's sacrosanct. It's the word of God. It's divine. But anyway, I think that the Pesach Seder is a specifically unique experience and way of sharing stories that I
I think,
don't know if other people have such a ritual like we do. But then I think with regards to the Jewish way of storytelling, you'd be able to answer that question more.
I think there are aspects to it. And if, there's a fancy academic word, you say paradigmatic. What it means is like Jewish culture has a non-linear notion of time, which say Aboriginal culture does too. So the idea is that dream time lives amongst you, that you're supposed to feel when you're at the Seder table as though you're undergoing Yetziat Mitzrayim itself. But when you honor the Churban, the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, you're supposed to mourn as though you were there, wailing at the walls being destroyed and, witnessing the Churban yourself. And thus, and it teaches you through that book, Eicha, it's terribly translated as Lamentations. It's not, it's why. Everything begins with Eicha, why? Why are these awful things happening to us? And it's quite an astonishing text. So, look, I think every culture mixes it. It's like when you cook, you're mixing those ingredients, cardamoms and whatever. And when you put the mix, I think all the flavors are there in most cultures. It's how you mix them and what you make more important. But it means that, say, music and words and sharing are there in all cultures. I just think the unique mix comes together. And so if you ask me for why one of the reasons I'm a Zionist is I'm aware it's a product of our history. It's a product of a particular historical experience that when nationalism comes along and changes Jewish identity and changes every modern European culture, Jews get it, the idea that you need an independent kingdom, and they're most ready to embrace this idea of nationalism. There's an argument made by many of the great Jewish historians that I read for my PhD. That's why in a country like Poland, and why I'm a Zionist too, this is part of our identity, there were, for example, Hashomer HaTza'ir had about 80,000 members on the eve of World War II. Just Hashi. There's about 3.5 million Jews in Poland. And, I just get emotional thinking about the wiping out of that entire culture. There's something like 60,000 in Beitar. B'nai Akiva has tens of thousands. Dror has tens of thousands. Poalei Zion, you have the right and left, also has tens of thousands. Literally dozens of different youth movements, and there are hundreds of thousands of Jews in those youth movements. And as one academic put it, Jews in Europe didn't have a choice not to be political, because every single European country was debating the question leading in the decades up to World War II, between World War, even, we'll focus on in between the two world wars, the place of the Jew. There's anti-Semitism is rife in many countries, and even those countries like Italy where it's not, that's where you see Zionism less there, but even the youth movements are even there. And youth movements, the Zionist youth movements are unique to the Jewish national movement in terms of what they're doing. And I found it fascinating, the journey of intellectually something like Ber Borochov on why Jews need to return to land and work it. He understands the Tanakh is an agricultural, storytelling, legal framework. It's a library, the Tanakh. It's poetry, it's literature, it's law, it's story, it's myth-making. It's all those things combined and interweaved. It's quite an astonishing library text. And he's saying we need to go back and work the land like our ancestors do. And in working back to return to work the land, it was an idea of those Maccabean or those Jews who fought in the Jewish revolts. They scared the Romans, where we get the English word assassin from. Sicari, the hardcore zealots who walk around killing Jews and non-Jews who were working with the Roman Empire. And they were violent, these zealots. So we get the word zealotry from, right? As I understand, I could be wrong on that, but that's my recollection of the history. And he looked back and said, those Jews who fought, we need to have a return to the land. And that was the whole idea of the Chalutz, the pioneer, etc. The need to entirely rethink and reimagine what Jewish identity is, what our path was, but all roads lead back to Yerushalayim. That's an astonishing thing, that these Jews in Europe look back to Jerusalem because the idea of Yerushalayim, the idea of Eretz Yisrael was embedded in our culture. It was a hard
and
to do. Yeah.
And it's central to all Jews, whether you call yourself a Zionist or not. And that's actually something that's pretty unbelievable because we have so many different perspectives and ways of understanding, but we all face Jerusalem at the end of the day. And Yerushalayim and Eretz HaKadosh is holy to all Jews, whether it's, holy from the religious, spiritual sense or wholly in the way of its maintaining Jewish identity and Jewish culture. But I just want to veer because I have a question for you, because I've been thinking about this a lot. We teach children about Holocaust, or now what you do is teaching about other genocides that have gone on in history, and survivors come and share their stories. And we always hear never again is now. Never again
Yeah.
is now. And then history repeats itself. Bad things are happening all over the place, not just in Israel. I mean, for me, what goes on in Israel is not political, it's personal. Not only the fact that I have family and friends, but it's my brothers and sisters, right? So for me, I feel very personal with everything that's going on in Israel. But the whole world, you've mentioned Russia and Ukraine, Sudan, does it actually educating children and the next generation, does it actually ensure that never again is now? What do you
No, of
think about
course
all
not.
the
No, look, I think that's a great question. So look, I think there's firstly, when I said to you, my focus is not what I can do, I can focus on here and change. I can take something like Bahati and help her heal through storytelling. That she's on that journey that I can do. So, the other day we celebrated her 50th birthday and she was like, a few years ago, like, I want to be able to just go out and be like this. It was a really beautiful thing. She said, I'm not trying to, and it's been a long journey to learn how to do that. So I can focus on that. And then if you come in, the other day we did a few programs together, just all these kids come up and hug her and say, that was amazing. You changed my life. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying we're in Australia is very different to being in Latin America and what's going on in, Venezuela, and other countries that are torn apart by political strife and violence and so forth. What's going on in Sudan, even the conflict between the DRC and Rwanda. I can't solve that here. But what we can say is the West, like this particular model we've created in Europe, spread out to countries like Israel, that's in many ways based on this aspect of Western democracy and liberalism. And then it's a unique combination between various aspects of Jewish culture. And I think that combination has led to a flourishing economy and a flourishing situation. Not that Israel's perfect. These conflicts that are occurring around the world that are distressing, I can't solve them, but these countries that are democracies, I live in a country like Australia where I can do something unique. I can take a Cambodian, a Sudanese, Rwandan, a Holocaust survivor, and a Bosnian and have a conversation with them. That is beautiful. Now, for me, like the question of my atheism aside, I'm very much informed by my Yiddishkeit. But also on top of that, recognizing that we are trying to do something really impossible here. That I live in Parramatta and there's a multitude of people. There's a school I want to do a program with, a wonderful school. I think they've worked out, they've got 180 different nation states representing their school, something like that. So it's ethnically diverse state, school in New South Wales. And by and large, the school doesn't have, compared to other parts of the world, a huge amount of problems. That's remarkable. So for me, the work that I can do is I say B'Tselem Elohim. Now, I don't literally believe, what does it actually mean to be image of God? But I go and say, what you correctly pointed out a moment ago earlier in our conversation, there aren't necessarily hugely unique things about us, about storytelling. Every culture tells stories back to itself. Now, there's some beautiful things that are distinct to the Jewish people. There are other things I've learned from working with Rwandans, Cambodians, Stolengen, where I'm like, that's amazing what you guys are doing. I'll be, in particular, the Rwandans that I work with, when they share their stories, they're particularly wise and reflective. I've never worked with a group of survivors who are as astonishingly self-reflective and vulnerable and open about what they went through. Even though I know most of what they went through, they're still hiding from me, even though I've interviewed them for hundreds of hours. And so again, coming back to what's the purpose here, I think if I take a Holocaust survivor or teach about the Holocaust like I went to a school recently, I did, as I said, 6-7 hours on the shot, or I've gone with Ernie and had a conversation, and you see the questions that kids asking about, what does it mean you never went to your father's gravesite? Do you still have nightmares? How did you forgive the Germans for what they did? They're thinking deeply, deeply about the human story. And they're making the connection that the Holocaust survivor in front of them is a human being like them. And that's what I think is possible through storytelling. The other day, I did some drumming for this program, and my Pakistani colleague, we began our program with this drumming for this drum. Has been such a crucial part of my wonderful friend and colleague, Ali's life. Ali's beautiful point is that I knew nothing about this drumming, but he took it to this group of kids in a public school and we made them drum and dance with us. And then I spoke about my Jewish family, and my great uncle was a rabbi. My grandfather set up the state of Israel, my adoption, living here in Australia, being an Australian from Jew, and then my journey a little bit to atheism. But the story was their story. Ali went through a totally different story, but we can connect. It's why we watch movies. It's why we do the Seder. It's that communal sharing of stories, I think, is a way to build empathy. So the question of never again is, I can't solve Sudan. I can't solve Rwanda, but those little drops that we make where Jews who lived in Persia or Jews that lived in India, like my family, were very strongly Indian. My grandparents spoke with an Indian accent. The food they ate became Iraqi, Indian, Jewish. They spoke Bengali and Hindustani, right? They loved, like my grandfather talked to me a great deal about Gandhi, amazing individual. And from that, I became obsessed with Indian history and Indian literature. And so I think that's what we can do when somebody comes in and I bring, if Bang was here or Bahati was here, any of the other incredible survivor storytellers that I have, that you'd be just as moved as if I had a Holocaust survivor. And that's what we created here in a country like Australia. And that's why I think podcasts like this are wonderful for all the things you and I don't agree with. It's about your story, my story. We see things differently. Shivim panim b'Torah, 70 faces of Torah. 70 faces is just what it means to be a Jew. I think that's actually what it's about.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that it's really important, and we can't underestimate the power of storytelling, of humanizing things, and of having conversations. And that's a big part of the Empowered Jew, is equipping and upskilling our community in order to engage in dialogue and have those conversations. And many Jews don't even want to engage in dialogue because they don't feel equipped enough, or they feel insecure because they don't feel like they know the facts or whatever, and they'll avoid it. And it's such a shame, because don't underestimate the power of a conversation and the power that it has for the good, and how we create that empathy through conversing, you know? And I think that that's really, really important. And I think that the work that you're doing is unbelievable.
And you too. I mean, genuinely, I'll say with the Empowered Jew and everything, I said, that time I've been thinking it quite a lot when we've sat in your living room and you shared your story and had your gorgeous little one around, and not in a selfish way, but to position yourself that way. And it's such a beautiful tari of God that it's the Empowered Jew. It is, I know I agree with you that there's sometimes a space out there where people do feel afraid to say, I'm Zionistic or I'm Jewish, you know? I've encountered it out here and out west, and even people who are friends of mine who are not Jewish, we've been walking along, they're like, I was speaking, Vish on the phone, and I don't speak Hebrew around here, and I don't want to be in that space. So I think it's really great, and I think it's really important, the kind of work you are doing as a podcast. I mean that genuinely. That I think podcasts are such an amazing art form, and so thank you for giving me the honor and privilege to come in here. There's so many things we leapt over and moved through.
I feel like we just scratched the surface. But Ari, thank you so much.
Thank you, Javi. I
really appreciate it.
Keep on doing the good work. Keep on being, a teacher and a mother and doing the important work that empowered you. And thank you for making me a little bit a part of that combo. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Ari. Thanks so much.